Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this big guy right here. This is the Kizer Critical. First off though, I want to thank Kizer Knives for sending this guy along. In the name of full disclosure, Kizer are the folks who sent this to me, and in fact I told them ahead of time, as usual, that I would be talking about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly, giving an honest review, and they did indeed send the knife along still. They've seen a couple of critical reviews, and not of the critical, but critical in the others. Anyways, moving on. And so they're still sending stuff, which I respect. So thank you very much. And this guy will go up on Patreon later with the proceeds to charity. So, yeah, thank you very much there, Kizer. But anyways, this is a knife that I saw on the wall at Blade Show and felt was very attractive, and still find the knife very pretty. And so that's pretty good. Size comparison-wise, this is a relatively large knife, although it's not all that huge. It looks a lot bigger than it is. Here it is up against your Spyderco PM2, Spyderco Delica, Ontario Rat number 2, and your steel wheel cut jack, 3.5-inch model. And so you can see here that in terms of absolute cutting length, it's not all that huge of a knife. It's about 3.5 inches here. But the knife itself is rather large. I mean, that's especially put out, you know, if you compare it to like the Spyderco sliver axe here. I mean, handle-wise, these are very different knives, but blade length-wise, they're in the same vicinity. So that's an interesting aspect of the size here. Then finally, this is, as far as I'm aware, the first collaboration with Matthew Christensen of Christensen Knife Works. So that's something to keep in mind, and a designer I haven't heard much about before. So anyways, let's go ahead, jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of your Kizer Critical here. So on the good side, first off, I'm going to say this does have an incredible balance to it. This is a knife that has a really big, thick blade on it and has really heavy handles in the back, but it's balanced in such a way through the use of these speed holes and probably the backspacer and otherwise that it really does, the balance on this knife is exceptionally good. I appreciate that very much, and it makes a knife that could feel really, really unwieldy, only feel slightly unwieldy. So I appreciate that very much. That's something that they clearly put effort into, and that's great. Next thing, I do love a good Wharncliffe blade. Wharncliffe blades are very good in a bunch of different cutting tasks. For me, at least, a lot of the cutting I do is cutting down into something. So like cutting up foam or boxes, things like that, or even draw cuts on tables, on things like paper or poster board. So for me, a Wharncliffe blade is a very, very good utility sort of cutting tool, and this is a very good Wharncliffe blade because you get a little bit of tip here, which is nice. You get a nice, reasonably tallish grind here. You get plenty of point, and you know, overall, I like this blade. It's a nice little warranty. It sure could be ground a little thinner, but such is life. And honestly, in terms of a serious Wharncliffe blade, this is one of the better ways to get a Wharncliffe blade in this price point, especially one with the aggressive tip on here. This is going for $200, which honestly, I don't think is super out of line. Maybe we could put that in the good. That's more in the neutral, because it is a big chunk of, S35 VN steel. Didn't mention that, but nicely designed and whatnot. I think the price is fine, and in terms of getting a warranty like this is one of relatively few ways to go about that. So that's, to me, good. Next thing, the jimping on the blade here is very nice in that it does give you texturing, 100%, but it's nicely rounded. I mean, if we take a look in there, it's got little chamfers here. This is a kind of jimping that is profoundly non-aggressive, meaning it's not, you know, chewing on everything else around you, but it is very much effective. So you can grab onto it, and so I like that very much. It's pretty excellent. Next thing, I am absolutely loving the finishing on the titanium here, because very often Kizer will do sort of a, do I have one of those around here? Kizer has in the past liked a very dark kind of blasting finish, and it's not super appealing to me. And on this guy, they've moved to a much more reflective silvery blasting. Maybe it's a smaller medium, a glass blast, whatever it is, it gives a little bit more play to the light. It doesn't feel like a dull gray mass. And it really sets off the hardware, the pivot, the blade well. This is a great blade finish, or I'm sorry, handle finish. And I hope to see more of it from Kizer, because it still gives some gripitude to it, 100%, but, you know, it also looks very attractive, so that's good to me. Speaking of very attractive, these pivot collars are great. It's just a piece of titanium that's been anodized using maybe some kind of a wire process, whatever. But it looks beautiful to me, at least. It adds a little bit of element of color to it, and it makes the knife a little bit more interesting, I think, color-wise than it would have otherwise been. And it sets off the backspacer here. I love these pivot collars, and I think they do a nice job, and they make the Kizer flowery sort of pivot look more attractive than than I've seen it in a long time. I'm not generally a huge fan of that, but in this knife with that surround, it's pretty A-okay. And goes nicely with the speed holes here. Design-wise, that's a great element. Next thing, speaking of the hardware, this is big hardware. 100%. We are looking at T10 in the pivot. We are looking at T8 back here. This is big hardware, and I appreciate that very much. In a world of T6, T8 is a joy, and T10, oh yeah, because it's harder to strip and whatnot, so that's great. Then finally, the action on this guy is particularly good. Even for, Kizer tends to do okay in the action department, but this very solid deploy and absolutely falls shut, given it's got a big, thick, heavy blade, and that absolutely helps. But still, it has a very solid lockup, solid lock bar tension, and it flips very reliably. They've done a great job with that, and this big old flipper tab is probably helping it too. So at least to me, that is the good of this guy. This has a very good action, big hardware, nice pivot collar here, loving the titanium finish, much more attractive than some of Kizer's other blasted finishes. Nice rounded jimping on the blade. It has a very nice little Wharncliffe blade, well, huge Wharncliffe blade, and it has very good balance in the hand, which I do appreciate. Let's talk about what's great here. To me, at least, what's great is that I find this knife personally very attractive. It has that sort of from across the room wow factor, and indeed, I saw this guy at Blade, and it blew me away. And it was enough that I asked for this guy specifically from Kizer, because I like so many elements of it. I like a nice stock Wharncliffe blade. Adding in this swedge here really makes it a little bit more interesting still. The pivot collar, I already said, I love the finishing on the handle. I do like these speed holes. I tend to be indifferent to speed holes, but this is very, very nicely done. They don't feel as ad hoc or just scattered around as they sometimes can. The lanyard hole thing back here, I think, is a very nice visual element. We'll come back to it later. But overall, and even the clip on this guy, with the nice rounding to match the backside, I love the look of this knife. Open or closed, I think this is a very, very attractive knife. And so, to me at least, that's what's great, is that Christensen here has created a beautiful freaking pocket knife, 100%. Let's talk about what's bad. Of course, the great here is standing for the completely freaking subjective, but it's a review. It's all freaking subjective. So anyways, moving on, into the bad. First off, this is not terribly subjective. This is a big knife. 100% of this is a heavy knife, and it's not a hugely space-efficient knife. If we compare this to a knife like the sliver axe here, same amount of blade length, but the critical here is just much bigger in terms of handle and whatnot. You can fit the sliver axe very nicely within the outline of the critical and have a fair amount left over to spare. And so this is a knife that, even though it's just around 3.5 inches, is way bigger in practice, and it is also very heavy. Even with the speed holes, the fact is it's got this big honkin' freaking blade in there, and it needs to balance. Comes in at 6.28 ounces. That's a very heavy knife, and it's something you're going to absolutely need to keep in mind here. Speaking of that blade stock, this is using very thick blade stock here. If we compare this to the PM2, for instance, you can see that this is thick, thick, thick. And unfortunately, what that means is that this is not God's gift to slicing. They've actually done a better job than I feared that they might, getting it down to a thin edge, and you can see that at the tip here. It's not absolutely brutally thick behind the edge, but I do wish that they had gone with thinner blade stock and that the knife on the whole was just a little bit slicier. Because Wharncliffe knives are so great as cutting tools that having a big, thick one, I don't know, doesn't bring me a lot of joy. Maybe they're trying to make sure that tip strength wasn't compromised, and doing this kind of angled down grind, which is the one aesthetic choice I don't really love here. I can see why they needed to do that, but I would have loved to have seen a hollow grind or a thinner stock or something to make this cut just a little bit better than it does. It does cut, and it cuts better than some, but I'd like to see that a little bit better, given this blade shape. But I always like to see slicier. Next thing, this is not quite setted. You can see here, I mean, it's close, but it's not quite there. And, you know, at $200, we're getting to the price range where that's becoming less and less acceptable. But, it is what it is there. Next thing, this is a little bit of a nitpick, but there is definitely a hot spot off of this corner here. You can see they've tried to put a chamfer on there, but anytime that you have that straight angle coming off the lock bar, It's very common to find a hot spot there, and it's one of few hot spots on this knife otherwise, and so I would have preferred that not be there, or they round that off, something along those lines. Then, next thing, I gotta say, this little area, I love the design overall, but this little area here feels a little bit superfluous. I would have almost liked to see them narrow that down. It feels like it wants to have a wave feature or something on the front of it, because then they could have knocked the weight down, but okay, I'm backseat design in here. And then finally, I guess I've already kind of covered this, but the knife is a little bit thick behind the edge, and as a result, this very tall blade ends up not being as slicey as you'd like. So at least to me, that's what's bad here, is that it is thick behind the edge because of this very thick stock and a relatively not that tall grind. You get that hot spot off the lock bar right up here. It's not very space efficient, and it's very big, and it's a very heavy knife. Let's talk about what's ugly, because sadly there's some serious ugly here. So, on the ugly side, first off, this has a really serious pocket pecking problem here. This is a huge flipper tab, and indeed, the whole knife is defining pocket pecker. I mean, it even looks like some kind of a crazy pigeon of some variety or another. I mean, this is a pocket pecker par freak at excellence. And unfortunately, it is unrounded. Rounding tends to, if you round these edges off, it tends to make it a little bit less of a problem beating on other things in your pocket there. It's huge, it's prominent, and it's big enough that it actually interferes, at least for my hands, with closing. Because as I close this knife using my normal technique, what happens, you'll see this here in the back. The flipper tab actually runs into my finger very often as I'm doing this. And so the pocket pecker is so prominent that it ends up hitting my finger every time I close the knife. I'm sure I can adjust around that. And indeed, I already, I've started to already, but that's just a sign that, holy crap, you need to dial the flipper tab back. I can see it being, maybe an aesthetic choice. Maybe that's, to get this big freaking blade moving. But I really don't like the size of this flipper tab. It is absolutely ginormous. Next thing, and a really ugly thing, is this lanyard hole extension in the back here. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not a lanyard fan in general, but this isn't about that. The issue here is these sharp corners. Because as you're flipping any flipper knife, an important aspect of it, here, I'll use this guy. An important thing is that you push the base of the knife into your hand, and then you use your index finger to produce pressure in the other direction, and that allows the knife to fire out there. On this guy, when you do that, you are plunging this very sharp corner right into your palm here. And so that means that every time I open this knife, there is a corner digging into my hand there. And indeed, every time I close the knife, there's a corner digging into my hand there. This is a really, really unfortunate execution. With these sharp corners, I can see why it would be great for the eye, and indeed it is very attractive, but it is terrible for the hand. Ergonomically, this is a huge miss, and this knife would have been way more compelling had this just been rounded off, or even had they taken there are many ways that this could have been done differently. They probably wouldn't have been as pretty, but my God, would they have been better in the hand. So this lanyard hole extension is awful, and if I were trying to keep this knife, I would absolutely be grinding it off, because it's just that bad. Then finally, on the ugly side, this does one of the worst things a pocket knife can do, and that is it has the ability to cut you well open. well closed. I'll see if I can show this off. Come on, phone, focus. There you go. You can see just how close the edge is to the back of this knife. It is just popping up right there. Again, trying to get the focus right here. That is right up there. And so it is very straightforward for me, without even any pressure, to touch the sharpened edge of this knife while this knife is closed. The pocket pecker here will defend the objects in your pocket from the blade, but it is just absolutely, deeply, and truly ugly. You should not ever be able to cut yourself with a knife that's closed, and unfortunately, trying to fit a blade that's this tall into a handle that's this thin very often winds up with danger like this. The thick blade stock just compounds the pain. And so that is deeply, deeply ugly. A knife that is closed should never have exposed blade, and the blade is right freaking here. Then coupling that with the other ugly, this lanyard hole extension, which is just an ergonomic miss, and then the pocket pecker from heck, those are some pretty ugly little uglies. Let's go into the final conclusion. Look, I am of two very strong minds on this knife. I love the look of it. I think this is a beautiful knife. It's very attractive. It's very bold. It's full of design. You can tell that the designer spent a lot of time thinking about the lines, the overall, and I find it very, very attractive. At that level, I love it. And frankly, I don't think the price is bad either. For a big old chunk of S35 VN titanium, reasonably well done, good design, I'm okay with that. But unfortunately, although it's very heavily designed, great design isn't just about the bold strokes that this does so well, but it's about the smart details, and that's where this falls short. Because the flipper tab is, although, very effective for moving this knife around, is a major issue in the pocket. It makes it a lot less attractive, a lot less pleasant to carry, and ends up, at least for me, hitting on the finger, and it's an unfortunate issue. This lanyard hole is, although very attractive, a really, really bad approach, and leads to a major ergonomic issue that, it just doesn't need to have. And then finally, the blade on this guy is just way too tall for the handle. And that leads this knife from being, pretty interesting to being a little bit dangerous. I really, really dislike when the blade is this close here, and it bothers the heck out of me. And so this ends up being a beautiful knife that I saw from afar and fell in love with, and I really want to like, but has a few major issues that are handicapping the ergonomics, the functionality, and the safety. And so it turns a knife that I like a lot into a knife I don't really like at all. So I'm hoping these are critical to addressing these issues, particularly the lanyard thing and the blade being so close. But for now, I'm afraid that the best this knife is going to get is a critical review. Sorry, I couldn't help but go there, but yeah. Anyways, hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.